The encounter. The forest was dense, its towering trees cloaked in thick fog that hung low like a ghostly veil. Ethan's boots crunched softly against the alien soil as he moved cautiously, his hand resting on the hilt of his worn-out plasma blade. The planet, known as Silos 5, was uncharted territory for most humans, but for scavengers like Ethan, it was a potential goldmine of forgotten tech and abandoned ships. His scanner beeped faintly, indicating a nearby metallic structure. Ethan squinted through the fog and spotted the outline of a large vessel half buried in the ground. The ship's exterior was cracked and scarred, as though it had been attacked and left to rot. Vines crawled over its surface, reclaiming it for the forest. This could be it, Ethan muttered to himself, his voice muffled by his helmet. His heart raced. A ship like this could hold rare technology, things he could sell for enough credits to leave this scavenger life behind. He approached the vessel slowly, noting the eerie silence. No birds, no insects, not even the hum of the ship's energy core. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Ethan hesitated at the open hatch, his instincts warning him to turn back. But curiosity, or perhaps desperation, drove him forward. The interior of the ship was dark and cold. Dust floated in the air, illuminated by the faint blue light of Ethan's wrist torch. The walls were lined with alien symbols he couldn't understand, and the floor was littered with broken machinery. His scanner picked up faint energy signatures deeper within the ship. As he moved through the narrow corridors, Ethan felt a strange sensation, like he was being watched. He paused, shining his torch behind him, but saw nothing. "It's just an old ship," he told himself, though his grip on the plasma blade tightened. Then he heard it, a faint sound, almost like a whisper. It was soft and shaky, carrying an unmistakable tone of fear. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. The sound came again, this time clearer. It was a cry for help. "Hello," Ethan called out, his voice echoing through the empty corridors. He waited, but there was no response. Gathering his courage, he followed the sound deeper into the ship. The source of the noise led him to a small room at the heart of the vessel. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, Ethan could see a faint red glow. He pushed the door open carefully, revealing a sight that made him stop in his tracks. In the center of the room sat a figure curled up against the wall. She was small and frail, with pale, almost translucent skin that shimmered faintly under the torchlight. Her hair, dark and tangled, fell over her face. But it was her eyes that held Ethan's attention. They were a brilliant crimson, glowing softly in the dim light. She flinched at the sound of the door, pressing herself tighter against the wall. Her sharp fangs glinted as she bared them in a defensive snarl, though her trembling hands betrayed her fear. "It's okay," Ethan said, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to hurt you." The girl didn't respond. Her eyes darted between Ethan and the device attached to her wrist. It was bulky and metallic, with wires that snaked up her arm and disappeared into her skin. The device emitted a faint hum, and Ethan realized it was drawing energy from her. She looked exhausted, her breathing shallow and ragged. "Who did this to you?" Ethan asked softly, though he didn't expect an answer. He crouched down slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. The girl tensed but didn't move as he examined the device. It was alien technology, far beyond anything Ethan had seen before, and it pulsed with a menacing glow. "I'm going to help you," he said, reaching for his toolkit. "Just don't bite me, okay?" She watched him cautiously as he worked. The device was fused to her skin, and Ethan could see small burns where the metal had overheated. He tried not to think about the pain she must have endured. The wires were tangled, but Ethan's hands were steady. Slowly, he began to disable the device. As he worked, the ship's lights flickered. A low rumble echoed through the corridors, and Ethan felt a sudden chill. The ship was waking up. "Not good," he muttered. "Not good at all." The girl's eyes widened, and for the first time, she spoke. Her voice was soft and melodic, but the words were in a language Ethan didn't understand. Still, her tone was clear. They needed to leave. With a final twist of his tool, the device powered down, and the girl gasped as if a weight had been lifted from her chest. Ethan helped her to her feet, her legs unsteady beneath her. She clung to his arm, her fear palpable. "We're getting out of here," Ethan said, guiding her toward the exit. But just as they reached the corridor, a loud alarm blared through the ship. Red lights flashed, and a mechanical voice droned in the alien language. Ethan didn't need a translator to understand the message. The ship was activating its defenses. They were out of time. Escape from danger. The forest outside was no longer silent. The mechanical hum of approaching drones filled the air, mingled with the harsh beeps of the ship's alarm system. Ethan tightened his grip on Lyra's arm. He had learned her name from a weak, whispered word as they fled the room, and quickened his pace, guiding her through the ship's narrow corridors. Lyra stumbled, her legs weak and unsteady. The device that had drained her energy was now gone, but the damage it caused lingered. Her glowing red eyes darted nervously, and her sharp ears twitched at every sound. "Stay with me," Ethan urged, his voice low but firm. "We're almost there." Ahead, the exit hatch loomed, but the ship wasn't going to let them leave so easily. A mechanical voice echoed through the halls, cold and emotionless, repeating the same phrase in the alien language. Ethan didn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. They were intruders, and they were about to face the consequences. The sound of clanking metal grew louder behind them. Ethan glanced over his shoulder and saw spider-like drones skittering through the corridors, their glowing eyes fixed on him and Lyra. Each step they took emitted a sharp metallic hiss. He cursed under his breath and activated his plasma blade with a sharp hiss. "We've got company," he muttered. Lyra looked at the drones and shivered, her claws twitching instinctively. Her fear was palpable, but there was something else in her expression. Shame. Ethan didn't have time to ask why. As the first drone lunged toward them, Ethan stepped forward, slicing it in half with his plasma blade. Sparks flew, and the drone collapsed into a pile of useless metal. More followed, their movements quick and coordinated. Lyra pressed herself against the wall, her hands trembling as she tried to summon the strength to fight. "You don't have to do anything," Ethan said, his blade cutting through another drone. "Just stay alive. That's enough." The drones came in waves, their attacks relentless. Ethan's muscles burned, and sweat dripped down his forehead as he fought to keep them at bay. The ship's alarm blared louder, the sound rattling in his ears. One of the drones managed to slip past him, its claws reaching for Lyra. She let out a small gasp and tried to move, but her body was too weak. Ethan turned just in time, throwing his body between her and the machine. The drone's claws scraped against his armor, leaving a shallow dent, but he managed to destroy it with a swift strike. "That's the last one," Ethan said, breathing heavily. He offered Lyra a weak smile. "We're still in one piece. Let's move." Lyra nodded, her glowing eyes filled with gratitude, and allowed him to pull her toward the hatch. But as they stepped outside, the real nightmare began. The forest was bathed in an eerie red light, the source of which was a large, hovering ship in the sky. Its sleek, black surface gleamed ominously, and its weapons were aimed directly at them. Smaller drones descended from the larger vessel, forming a perimeter around Ethan and Lyra. Ethan's heart sank. This wasn't just about the ship's defense system. Someone, or something, had been tracking Lyra, and now they were here to claim her. "Stay close," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. He scanned the area, looking for an escape route. The dense forest offered some cover, but they wouldn't make it far with Lyra in her weakened state. One of the drones hovered closer, projecting a hologram of an alien figure. The figure was tall and imposing, with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. It spoke in the same alien language Ethan had heard before, but this time, The words were translated into broken English. "Return the girl," the voice commanded. "She is property of the sovereign order. Interference will result in termination." Ethan tightened his grip on his plasma blade. "Property," he repeated, his voice laced with anger. He looked at Lyra, who lowered her head in shame. "She's not property. She's a person." The hologram flickered, and the voice responded with a chilling calmness. "You have 10 seconds to comply." Ethan glanced at Lyra. "Can you run?" She shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "No, I'll only slow you down." "Not an option," he said firmly. "I didn't come this far to abandon you." The countdown began. Ethan's mind raced as he calculated their chances. The drones were too fast to fight head-on, and the ship above could destroy them in seconds. They needed a distraction, something to buy them time. He spotted a cluster of large, glowing plants nearby. Their bioluminescence pulsed in a rhythmic pattern, and Ethan remembered reading about similar flora in a survival guide. They were highly volatile when exposed to heat. "Stay behind me," he told Lyra, guiding her toward the plants. He activated his plasma blade and struck the base of the nearest one. The plant trembled, and a high-pitched whine filled the air. The drones reacted instantly, their attention shifting to the unstable plants. Ethan grabbed Lyra's hand and pulled her into the forest as the plants exploded, releasing a bright flash and a wave of heat. The shockwave knocked several drones out of the sky, and the remaining ones scrambled to recalibrate. Ethan and Lyra didn't stop running until they were deep within the forest, the sounds of pursuit fading behind them. When they finally stopped, Ethan leaned against a tree, his chest heaving. "Are you okay?" he asked, looking at Lyra. She nodded weakly. "You saved me." Ethan managed a tired smile. "Don't thank me yet. We're not out of this mess." Above them, the ship's lights scanned the forest, searching for its prey. Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before they were found again. But for now, they had a chance. The slim one, but a chance nonetheless. Hunted. The night was thick with tension as Ethan and Lyra moved cautiously through the dense forest. The towering trees provided some cover, their leaves forming a protective canopy against the cold, watchful eyes of the drones. Despite the explosions from earlier, Ethan knew the enemy wasn't far behind. The high-pitched hum of drones echoed faintly in the distance, a chilling reminder that they were still being hunted. Lyra stumbled again, her legs barely supporting her frail frame. Ethan turned, catching her before she could fall. Her glowing red eyes, now dimmer than before, met his, filled with exhaustion and a touch of shame. "You can't keep pushing yourself like this," Ethan said gently, his voice low but firm. "We need to find a safe spot for you to rest." Lyra shook her head. "No, they'll find us. I'll slow you down." "You're not slowing me down," he replied firmly, helping her to her feet. "We're in this together, remember." She hesitated but nodded, allowing him to lead her deeper into the forest. Ethan's mind raced as he considered their options. The mercenaries weren't just after a bounty. They wanted Lyra specifically. Her weakened state and the strange device they had removed from her wrist hinted at something bigger, a secret Ethan didn't yet understand. The sound of snapping twigs broke his train of thought. Ethan froze, his hand instinctively reaching for his plasma blade. Lyra stiffened beside him, her sharp senses picking up on the movement before Ethan could. "They're close," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan scanned the forest, his eyes darting between the shadows. The faint red glow of a drone's light flickered through the trees, drawing closer with every second. He tightened his grip on the blade, his muscles tensing. "Stay low," he whispered to Lyra, gesturing for her to hide behind a large, moss-covered boulder. She obeyed, her fragile body trembling as she crouched down. The drone appeared, hovering just a few feet above the ground. Its spider-like limbs moved with eerie precision, its red sensor scanning the area. Ethan pressed himself against a tree, holding his breath as the drone's light passed dangerously close to his position. Suddenly, a small animal, A rodent-like creature with glowing fur darted across the forest floor. The drone immediately shifted its focus, chasing the movement. Ethan exhaled quietly, relief washing over him. But the reprieve was short-lived. More drones emerged from the shadows, their lights crisscrossing the area in a synchronized search pattern. Ethan knew they were cornered. Running wasn't an option anymore. "I'll create a distraction," Ethan said, crouching beside Lyra. "You stay hidden and wait for my signal. Then you run as fast as you can." "No," she hissed, grabbing his arm with surprising strength. "You'll get caught. Or worse. Better me than you," he replied with a faint smile. "They're not after me, remember." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue further. Ethan handed her a small device from his belt, a beacon that emitted a faint, pulsating light. "Follow this if we get separated," he said. "It'll guide you to safety." Without waiting for her response, Ethan stood and moved away from the boulder, making just enough noise to draw the drone's attention. The machines immediately turned toward him, their red lights locking onto his figure. "Come on, you metal pests," Ethan muttered, breaking into a sprint. The drones followed, their mechanical limbs clicking against the forest floor. Ethan led them away from Lyra, weaving through the trees and ducking under low-hanging branches. His heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't slow down. After several minutes of running, Ethan reached a small clearing. The ground was uneven, littered with jagged rocks and patches of glowing moss. He skidded to a halt and turned to face the approaching drones, his plasma blade humming to life. "Let's see what you're made of," he said, a grim determination in his voice. The first drone lunged at him, its razor-sharp claws glinting in the dim light. Ethan sidestepped and slashed, severing its limbs in one swift motion. Sparks flew as the machine collapsed, its red light flickering before going dark. Two more drones rushed him, their movements faster and more coordinated. Ethan blocked one with his blade, the impact jolting his arm, and kicked the other away. But he was outnumbered, and fatigue was setting in. Suddenly, a high-pitched screech pierced the air. Ethan turned to see Lyra standing at the edge of the clearing, her eyes glowing brighter than ever. She raised her trembling hands, and a wave of energy erupted from her, slamming into the remaining drones. The machines were thrown back, crashing into the trees with a deafening noise. Ethan stared at her in shock. "Lyra, what was that?" She collapsed to her knees, panting heavily. I couldn't let them take you. Not after everything you've done for me." Before Ethan could respond, a new sound filled the air, the unmistakable roar of a ship's engines. The mercenaries were closing in, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they came for. "We have to move," Ethan said, pulling Lyra to her feet. "Can you walk?" She nodded weakly. "I'll try." Together, they stumbled back into the forest, the glow of the mercenary ship casting long, ominous shadows over their path. The hunt wasn't over, but Ethan was determined. He wouldn't let them take Lyra. Not now. Not ever. Trust and bonding. The cave was cold and damp, its walls slick with moisture from the misty forest outside. Ethan lit a small survival lamp, its warm glow barely illuminating the confined space. He gently helped Lyra to sit on a patch of dry ground, her frail body trembling from exhaustion. Outside, the faint hum of the mercenary ship's engines faded into the distance, but neither of them felt safe. "You need to rest," Ethan said, setting his backpack down and rummaging through its contents. He pulled out a small ration pack and handed it to her. "Eat this. It's not much, but it'll help." Lyra took the pack hesitantly, her long fingers brushing against his for a brief moment. Her glowing red eyes flickered with uncertainty as she sniffed the contents. The human food was unfamiliar to her, but hunger won over caution, and she took a small bite. Ethan watched her in silence, his mind racing. He had no idea what he'd gotten himself into. Lyra wasn't just another alien. She was something rare, something powerful. The way she had unleashed that energy wave back in the clearing had been both terrifying and awe-inspiring. But she was also vulnerable, clearly abandoned by her own kind and hunted like an animal. After a few moments, Lyra broke the silence. Her voice was soft, almost musical, though her words were halting. "Why are you helping me?" Ethan leaned back against the cave wall, letting out a tired sigh. "Honestly, I don't know. Maybe because you needed help and no one else was around. Or maybe because I've been in your shoes before." She tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. "In my shoes?" "It's an expression," Ethan said with a faint smile. "It means I know what it feels like to be left behind, to have no one to turn to." Lyra's gaze dropped to the ground. "My people. They said I was dangerous, that I could not be controlled. So they left me. I tried to be what they wanted, but it was never enough." Her voice broke, and Ethan felt a pang of empathy. He had heard similar stories before. Outcasts, refugees, people cast aside for being different. But hearing it from Lyra, seeing the pain in her eyes, made it hit differently. "You're not dangerous," Ethan said firmly. "You're just different, and different isn't a bad thing." She looked up at him, her expression a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "You don't fear me," Ethan chuckled. "After what we just went through, fear's not the first thing on my mind. Besides, you saved my life back there. I owe you one." Lyra's lips curled into a small smile, the first genuine one he'd seen. It was fleeting, but it was enough to remind him that beneath the alien exterior, she wasn't so different from him after all. The moment was interrupted by a low growl from outside the cave. Ethan tensed, grabbing his plasma blade. Lyra's eyes widened as she strained to hear the sound. It wasn't the mechanical hum of a drone or the roar of a ship. It was something organic. "Stay here," Ethan whispered, rising to his feet. He moved toward the cave entrance, his blade ready. Outside, the forest was bathed in darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of bioluminescent plants. Ethan scanned the area, his every nerve on edge. The growling grew louder, and then he saw it, a predator native to the planet, its sleek, scaled body prowling through the underbrush. Its glowing yellow eyes locked onto him, and it let out a guttural snarl. Ethan tightened his grip on the blade. "Great, just what we needed." The creature lunged, its claws glinting in the dim light. Ethan dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding its attack. He slashed with his blade, grazing the creature's side. It howled in pain but didn't retreat. Before it could strike again, a sudden burst of energy lit up the cave entrance. Lyra stood there, her hands outstretched and glowing with the same energy she had used before. The predator froze, its glowing eyes narrowing in confusion. "Leave," Lyra commanded, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. The creature hesitated, its instincts battling with the fear radiating from Lyra's power. After a tense moment, it backed away, disappearing into the shadows. Ethan lowered his blade, letting out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Remind me not to get on your bad side." Lyra's hands dropped to her sides, the glow fading. She swayed on her feet, and Ethan rushed to catch her before she collapsed. "You didn't have to do that," he said, helping her back inside the cave. "You're going to burn yourself out." "I couldn't let it hurt you," she murmured, her voice weak. Ethan shook his head. "You're too stubborn for your own good, you know that." She managed a faint smile, leaning against him as he guided her back to her spot. He wrapped a thermal blanket around her and sat down beside her, his own exhaustion catching up with him. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence was comfortable, a rare moment of peace in the chaos. Ethan glanced at Lyra, who had fallen into a light sleep, her breathing steady. Despite everything, she looked almost serene. As he stared at the cave walls, Ethan realized something. He wasn't just helping Lyra out of pity or some sense of duty. He cared about her, this strange, fragile, powerful girl who had been cast aside by her own people, and he would do whatever it took to protect her. Outside, the forest was still, but Ethan knew the danger wasn't over. The mercenaries would find them eventually. But for now, they had a chance to rest, to recover, and to prepare for what lay ahead. A desperate stand. The stillness of the cave didn't last long. The faint hum of approaching drones began to vibrate through the ground, growing louder with every second. Ethan's instincts flared. They'd been found. Again. Lyra stirred, her crimson eyes fluttering open. She instantly sat upright, her senses sharper than his. "They're here," she whispered, her voice tight with dread. Ethan nodded grimly. "Yeah, and they're not knocking politely." The forest outside lit up with the familiar red glow of searchlights, cutting through the dark like slicing blades. The mercenary ship hovered above the treetops, its engines rumbling with menace. Drones poured from its underbelly like a swarm, spreading out in a calculated pattern. Ethan scanned their surroundings. The cave was a dead end. No back exit, no hidden escape routes. Their only chance was to stand their ground. He glanced at Lyra, her frail form sitting rigidly, her hands trembling slightly. "I'll handle this," he said firmly, grabbing his plasma blade and checking his makeshift traps near the cave entrance. "You just stay out of sight." Lyra shook her head, her voice wavering but resolute. "I won't hide while you fight alone." "Lyra," Ethan started, but she cut him off. "I won't lose you," she said, her eyes glowing brighter. "Not after everything you've done for me." Ethan opened his mouth to argue but stopped. There was a fire in her gaze, a determination he hadn't seen before. He sighed, relenting. "Okay, but we do this smart. Stick to the plan." She nodded, and they prepared for the inevitable assault. Ethan had rigged makeshift explosives using components from his toolkit and the bioluminescent plants he'd gathered earlier. They weren't much, but they'd slow the mercenaries down. Lyra positioned herself in the shadows near the back of the cave, her hands faintly glowing as she gathered her energy. The first wave came quickly. The drones, their mechanical eyes scanning the cave, spotted Ethan immediately. They surged forward, their claws clicking against the rocky ground. "Come on," Ethan shouted, activating one of his traps. A small explosive went off, sending a shockwave through the narrow entrance and shattering the front ranks of the drones. Sparks flew as their broken bodies collapsed, but more replaced them almost instantly. Ethan swung his plasma blade with precision, cutting through the relentless swarm. Each strike was calculated, efficient, but the drones were overwhelming. For every one he destroyed, two more took its place. Behind him, Lyra's breathing quickened. She closed her eyes, focusing on the energy building in her hands. A faint red aura began to surround her, pulsating like a heartbeat. The second wave brought mercenary soldiers, tall, armored figures armed with energy rifles. They entered cautiously, their weapons aimed directly at Ethan. The leader, a towering figure with a jagged scar across his alien face, barked an order in his native language. Ethan gritted his teeth. "Great. The boss is here." The soldiers opened fire, their shots ricocheting off the cave walls. Ethan ducked and rolled, narrowly avoiding the blasts. He returned fire with a small energy pistol, but it barely dented their armor. From the shadows, Lyra stepped forward. Her eyes blazed, and her aura grew brighter. The soldiers hesitated, their weapons faltering as they took in the sight of her. She raised her hands, and a wave of energy erupted from her body, slamming into the soldiers and sending them flying. Ethan shielded his eyes from the flash, stunned by the sheer force of Lyra's power. When the dust settled, the soldiers were either unconscious or retreating, their leader shouting angrily into his communicator. But the victory was short-lived. A deafening roar echoed through the cave as the mercenary ship began to descend. Its weapons charged, and the ground beneath them shook. "They're going to level the whole cave," Ethan shouted, grabbing Lyra's arm. "We have to move." Lyra hesitated, her expression torn. "I can stop them." Ethan stared at her, his heart sinking. "No, you can't. Not like this. You'll kill yourself." Her voice was calm, almost resigned. "If I don't, they'll kill us both, and they'll never stop hunting me." Ethan's grip on her arm tightened. There's another way. There has to be. She smiled faintly, the sadness in her eyes cutting deeper than any blade. You gave me hope when I had none, Ethan. Let me return the favor. Before he could respond, she broke free from his grasp and stepped into the open. The ship's weapons locked onto her immediately, but she didn't flinch. Her entire body began to glow, her energy surging to its peak. Ethan watched in horror and awe as Lyra unleashed a massive wave of red light. It shot upward, engulfing the ship and the surrounding drones. The force of the blast sent Ethan flying backward, and he hit the cave wall hard, his vision swimming. When the light faded, the ship was gone, disintegrated into nothingness. The forest was silent once more, the only sound the faint crackle of energy dissipating in the air. Ethan scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding. Lyra, he shouted, searching the cave. She was lying on the ground, motionless. Her glow had faded, and her breathing was shallow. Ethan rushed to her side, cradling her fragile form in his arms. Don't you dare give up on me, he said, his voice breaking. You hear me? We're not done yet. Her eyes fluttered open, a faint smile playing on her lips. I'm still here. Relief flooded through him, but it was short-lived. He knew they couldn't stay. The mercenaries might regroup, and Lyra needed medical attention. We're getting out of here, Ethan said, his voice resolute. And this time, I'm not letting anyone take you away. With Lyra in his arms, he stepped out of the cave and into the forest. The battle wasn't over, but for now, they had won a small victory. And for the first time, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. The hidden strength. Ethan trudged through the dense forest, Lyra cradled in his arms. The aftermath of her energy blast still lingered in the air, a faint static hum that made the hair on his arms stand on end. The mercenary ship was gone, obliterated in an instant, but Ethan's instincts told him the danger was far from over. The moonlight filtered through the canopy above, casting dappled shadows across the forest floor. Lyra's breathing was shallow, her usually bright crimson eyes dim as she rested against his chest. Her pale skin, once shimmering faintly, now looked almost translucent. You're going to be okay, Ethan muttered, more to himself than her. I just need to get us somewhere safe. Lyra stirred slightly, her voice weak but determined. Ethan, I can walk. No chance, he replied firmly. You just saved both of us back there. The least I can do is carry you. Her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile before her head rested back against his shoulder. Despite her exhaustion, there was a quiet strength in her, an unyielding will that Ethan couldn't help but admire. After what felt like hours, Ethan found a small clearing surrounded by thick trees and glowing plants. A stream of crystal-clear water trickled nearby, its soothing sound providing a brief respite from the chaos of the day. He gently set Lyra down on a soft patch of moss and began scanning the area for any signs of pursuit. The silence was unnerving. Ethan had expected reinforcements, more drones, or even another ship. But so far, nothing had come. It was as if Lyra's power had scared them off, or wiped them out entirely. As he crouched by the stream, filling his canteen, Lyra's voice broke the quiet. They'll come back. Ethan turned to see her sitting up, her glowing eyes fixed on him. There was a clarity in her gaze that hadn't been there before, a steely resolve that sent a chill down his spine. They always do, she continued, her voice stronger now. They won't stop until I'm dead, or until they have me under their control again. Ethan walked over and sat beside her, handing her the canteen. Then we make sure they never get the chance. She took a sip, her hands trembling slightly. You don't understand. My people, they think I'm a threat to the entire galaxy. That's why they abandoned me. They'll send more. And it won't just be mercenaries next time. It'll be worse. Ethan frowned. Worse how? She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the ground. They have hunters, elite soldiers trained to track and kill. They won't care who you are or what you've done to protect me. They'll destroy anything in their path. Ethan leaned back, his mind racing. He had faced danger before: pirates, rival scavengers, even hostile wildlife. But this was different. This was bigger than him, bigger than Lyra. And yet, he couldn't walk away. Not now. "Let them come," he said finally, his voice steady. "We'll deal with them together." Lyra's eyes widened, a mixture of surprise and disbelief. "Why would you risk your life for me? I'm not even human." Ethan smirked. "Yeah, well, you're better company than most humans I've met. Besides, you're not just some helpless kid. You're powerful, Lyra. You've got something they fear. And that's why they want to control you." Her expression softened, a flicker of hope crossing her face. "You really believe that?" "I do," he said firmly. "And I think you're capable of a lot more than you realize." As the night wore on, Lyra's strength slowly began to return. Ethan worked on fortifying their makeshift camp, setting up traps and barriers using materials from his pack and the surrounding forest. Lyra watched him quietly, her mind racing with thoughts she hadn't dared to entertain before. For the first time, she felt a spark of something she hadn't known in years: purpose. Ethan's unwavering faith in her, despite knowing so little about her past, was both humbling and inspiring. Maybe she wasn't just a danger. Maybe she could be something more. Later, as the first rays of dawn pierced through the trees, Lyra stood and walked to the edge of the clearing. Her legs were still weak, but she pushed herself forward, drawing on the strength Ethan had seen in her all along. Ethan approached, his plasma blade strapped to his side. "You should be resting." Lyra turned to him, her crimson eyes glowing faintly in the morning light. "No, I need to be ready." "Ready for what?" he asked, his brow furrowed. "To fight," she said simply. "Not just to survive, but to end this. If my people want me dead, I'll show them why they're afraid of me. And if they come for you, I'll protect you." Ethan studied her for a moment, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You're a lot tougher than you look, you know that." She smirked, her confidence growing. "You're not so bad yourself." For the first time since they had met, the tension between them eased. They weren't just running anymore. They were preparing. Together, they would face whatever came next, and for the first time, Lyra believed they might actually win. But as the sunlight bathed the forest, a shadow passed overhead. Ethan and Lyra looked up simultaneously, their expressions hardening. A new ship loomed in the sky, its sleek design more menacing than the one before. "They're here," Lyra said, her voice calm but firm. Ethan nodded, gripping his blade. "Then let's show them what we're made of." The final fight. The air vibrated with the low rumble of the new ship's engines as it descended above the forest. Its sleek, black hull gleamed under the rising sun, and its massive size dwarfed the surrounding trees. Ethan and Lyra stood in the clearing, their gazes fixed on the ominous craft. It wasn't just a transport vessel. It was a warship. The enemy had sent their elite hunters. Ethan tightened his grip on his plasma blade, his jaw clenched. This is it, then. Their last play. Lyra's crimson eyes glowed faintly as she stepped forward, her confidence stronger now. "They think they're unstoppable. They've never seen what we can do together." Ethan glanced at her, a faint grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Let's make sure they regret it." The ship's landing gear extended, crushing trees and leveling the ground beneath it. A ramp lowered with a mechanical hiss, and out stepped the hunters. They were tall and imposing, their armor gleaming with alien symbols, and their weapons humming with lethal energy. At the center of the group was their leader, a figure even more fearsome than the rest. His presence radiated authority, and his eyes locked onto Lyra with cold determination. "You cannot win," the leader called out in a deep, resonant voice. "Surrender the girl, and your death will be swift." Ethan smirked. "Thanks for the offer, but I think we'll pass." The leader's expression darkened. With a wave of his hand, the hunters advanced, their movements precise and coordinated. Ethan and Lyra exchanged a glance, their silent understanding clear. They would fight, side by side, until the end. The battle begins. The first wave of hunters rushed toward them, their energy weapons blazing. Ethan darted forward, his plasma blade a blur as he deflected the incoming shots. He moved with precision, his years of scavenger life and combat experience serving him well. Every swing of his blade was calculated, every movement deliberate. Lyra, meanwhile, stood her ground, her energy building within her. Her hands glowed with a crimson light, and the air around her seemed to ripple with power. As the hunters closed in, she unleashed a shockwave that sent them flying backward, their armor cracking under the force. The leader watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. He raised his arm, signaling the next wave. More hunters emerged from the ship, each one larger and more heavily armed than the last. Ethan's breath hitched, but he didn't falter. "We're just getting started," he shouted, charging into the fray. The battle intensified. Ethan fought with everything he had, his blade carving through the hunters' ranks. Lyra's energy blasts lit up the battlefield, her power growing stronger with each attack. But the hunters were relentless, their numbers seemingly endless. A dangerous turn. As the fight raged on, the leader finally stepped forward, his massive weapon humming with energy. He moved with the precision of a predator, his strikes calculated and devastating. Ethan met him head-on, their blades clashing in a shower of sparks. "You're protecting something you don't understand," the leader growled, his voice cold. "She's a danger to your kind as much as ours." Ethan gritted his teeth, pushing back against the leader's strength. "She's not a danger. She's a person, and she's got more courage than all of you combined." The leader's eyes narrowed. With a sudden surge of power, he knocked Ethan back, sending him sprawling to the ground. He raised his weapon for the killing blow, but before he could strike, a crimson barrier appeared between them. Lyra stepped forward, her energy forming a protective shield around Ethan. Her eyes burned with determination as she faced the leader. "You will not hurt him," she said, her voice steady and commanding. The leader sneered. "You can't control your power. You'll destroy everything." Lyra's expression hardened. "I've learned to control it, thanks to him." She raised her hands, and the ground beneath the leader began to quake. Crimson tendrils of energy erupted from the earth, wrapping around his legs and arms. He struggled against them, but Lyra's power was too strong. The final stand. With the leader immobilized, the remaining hunters hesitated. Lyra turned to Ethan, who was struggling to his feet. "We can end this," she said. "Together." Ethan nodded, gripping his blade tightly. "Let's finish it." The two of them moved as one. Lyra's energy blasts cleared a path through the remaining hunters, while Ethan's blade cut down those who tried to flank them. The hunters' ranks began to thin, their cohesion crumbling as fear took hold. The leader, still trapped by Lyra's energy, let out a furious roar. With a burst of strength, he broke free from the tendrils and charged toward her. Ethan intercepted him, their blades clashing in a final, desperate duel. "Go," Ethan shouted. "Take him down." Lyra hesitated for only a moment before summoning all her remaining strength. Her body glowed brighter than ever, her energy radiating outward in waves. She raised her hands, and a massive sphere of crimson light formed above her. "Ethan, move," she cried. Ethan dove out of the way as Lyra unleashed the sphere. It collided with the leader, engulfing him in a blinding explosion of light and heat. When the dust settled, the leader and his hunters were gone, their ship reduced to smoldering ruins. The aftermath. Ethan stumbled toward Lyra, who had collapsed to her knees, her energy spent. He dropped beside her, pulling her into his arms. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with awe and relief. "You really did it." Lyra smiled weakly, her eyes meeting his. "We did it." The forest was silent once more, the morning sun casting a golden glow over the clearing. For the first time in days, they were safe. Ethan helped Lyra to her feet, supporting her as they began to walk. "So what now?" he asked. Lyra looked up at him, her gaze soft but determined. "Now we find a place where we can be free." Ethan grinned. "Sounds like a plan." Together, they disappeared into the forest, their bond stronger than ever. The galaxy might still be dangerous, but as long as they had each other, they knew they could face anything.